like we understand that everyone has passions, and we'd like to make life a little bit fun with them. And we understand designs are passions, and we're willing to work with you to get things done. But today, I'm just doing a small 30-minute quick dive into a few topics on iOS development. Nothing too big. Basically, I have to note that it's a quick overview, just as Carla mentioned. I'm pretty much going to take about 5-6 minutes on 4 different topics. So, my 4 topics here are memory management, ARC versus non-ARC. I'll explain that in just a second. Instruments, which is useful for checking out memory leaks, being able to profile your app. Look for something called zombies. That's not as interesting as it sounds. Anyway, got storyboards, which is something that you could use, you couldn't use. I kind of explain the kind of compare and contrast there. And being able to put multiple targets into your project for your apps, which can help you deploy for multiple clients or multiple platforms. So first off, of course, is memory management, ARC versus non-ARC. And what exactly is ARC? It stands for automatic reference count. See, the thing is, with a lot of development, we usually use objects, and objects usually need to be able to count how many times something owns an object. It's like having someone buy a car and then your whole family owns the car, like your son drive it, your wife drive it, or whatever. You have to make sure that you know who owns that car. If we end up not counting who owns this car, we might have nobody own the car and it'll just be standing there abandoned and everyone's just going to take the wheels off it or something. So we use one way we can do that is using automatic reference counting. This is something that was introduced for iOS 5 with Xcode 4.2. That is one of the most recent versions of Xcode, and also iOS, the most recent version of iOS, until iOS 6 comes out. It's mostly compatible with iOS 4. There's one small thing. There's no weak keyword. If anyone wants me to explain what weak means, I can tell you. It's not too important though most of the time. Now, what ARC does for you is usually before it came out, us developers would have to be able to manually manage memory. A lot of programming languages, you do have to do that. Thankfully, Apple's nice to us because this can be a pain, definitely a pain. Usually you would have to allocate resources and then release them when you're done. Sometimes you forget to release, sometimes you forget to allocate them. Then you can get errors in memory without meaning to. And that could be a pain to debug and take half an hour for something that would do only a slight improvement. So ARC allows us to be a little bit more careful about that. And the diagram to the right comes from Apple's own development page for this. Basically just shows you right in a nutshell how much reference counting helps compared to manual memory management, because you don't have to write as much code. It takes quite a bit of not just much code, but kind of boring boilerplate code, so you get to work on the stuff that actually matters. Note that ARC is not something that is done at runtime when you run your app, which would obviously add to the time that someone has to load your app, and a lot of people, don't really like having to wait around for something that's even kind of simple. So instead, it actually comes into your project at compile time. It basically adds the code in that you would usually release and retain. So it's basically the same thing, except that it's basically done for you instead of you having to worry about it, just like a lot of other optimizations to get your program to work right. So that's a new project. An existing project, it's actually not too hard to get started with it. If you look at your menu, you can select Edit, Refactor, and go ahead and convert to Objective-C ARC. It's mostly simple. There's a wizard that guides you to it. There may be some manual conversion that is needed. It'll actually tell you exactly what you will need to do. So Apple's kind of nice in that regard, and for the most part, you won't have to be going around finding little tiny things once this works. Unlike a lot of tools I've used that are kind of like this, where half works and a half doesn't, and honestly, it's just not worth it because it doesn't save me any time when I'm trying to look for half the things I didn't do like I thought it would. But I do need to keep a few things in mind. If you've been an Objective-C developer for a while, you know that you have to use the retain keyword a lot when you're defining the properties and other places as well, which means you add one to your reference count so that you make sure that somebody wants to keep a hold of this object. Now, Apple recommends that you use the strong keyword. This is basically the same thing. There's actually there's no difference. It is a synonym. It's just the kind of metaphor model we're looking at between strong and weak. Basically, retain kind of makes you think about how you have to manage it, but strong just says you want this type of object. And so it kind of makes it say that, you know, Apple's going to do it for you with Arc. You also, since you are using Arc and you're not managing your own memory, you can't use retain, release, or auto-release. Those are all memory management keywords. And since you're not doing it, it's probably not a good idea that they begin with. Also, the dealloc method. That's usually used to get rid of stuff. You can still have it, but you can't actually release because the release keyword doesn't work. There are other things you can do. Sometimes you want to get rid of, you want to be able to do some shutdown code or something. So that's why the dealloc keyword is still around. Core foundation objects. One of the most well-known ones is core graphics, which is used for example, building layers to make your views on a lower level than what you usually use for creating your views. Or sometimes you want to draw objects to the screen. It's obviously a very useful set of classes, but they're not actually managed by this because they're a separate set from the usual NS kind of stuff, which means basically abbreviation for next step, which is what Objective-C was originally for. But that doesn't matter too much, but you do have to remember, if you use core foundation objects, they're not managed. You have to use CF retain, CF release. So you do have to keep that in mind. And finally, if you ever use auto-release pools, which basically means that you have a set of objects you would like to be able to not have to worry about when you retain and release, basically you would have to put it into a pool. You do the same thing now, except you don't create an object. You just use @auto-release pool and put your code inside curly brackets like you would for using scope for any other sort of coding like loops or methods, things like that. I kind of want to go over the pros and cons of using them. Sometimes they will be very useful, but for us, most of the applications we develop, we don't really see as much use. But what is a storyboard, first off? It is a new way that Apple gave for creating and organizing views. It was introduced for iOS 5. Basically what you do is, instead of having separate nib files, if you're used to Xcode development and you're or a designer of views, to be able to get your views to be able to go through your project, instead of having a separate file for each every view, you have them all in one container, a storyboard container that's a file. All your views, all your view controllers go in there. And besides having use of view controllers, you actually have segues. Segues connect from one view controller or one view to another controller, another view. And not just let you say click a button, go to the next one. You can also add animations and be able to see if maybe you call some other code. This is an example storyboard, but basically I'm showing that there's two branches from the tab bar. This is a tab bar based program. You have the top one shown, which is for players. This is basically sort of an example application for seeing like board game players or something. You have a database of board game players for like chess or something. So you can kind of see how the tab bar on the top is one set of tab bar. You have a view controller, and you have a navigation control on top of it. And you see how there's connections between them. It's a very simple way to visualize things. Also note that there is a cell right there on the right. I'll explain that in just a second. First off, I do want to note the pros. It's always good to know the pros before the cons, in my opinion. But first off, like I said, simpler communications between view controllers due to the segues idea. You got a complete look at the application flow. Everything is in there in that one little thing. You reduce your clutter within your project from having many nibs. I mean, a lot of times we have them all organized in one big column of views, and sometimes it's hard to remember, oh, this one is named something, this one isn't. Whereas here you would say, oh, this name definitely is associated with this view, and we have everything in this view. And one of the biggest challenges for developers is honestly naming things. So it's kind of useful to be able to see it all visually. We also have, I kind of mentioned the communication between view controllers. The segue is for that, but it also replaces the code for creating new screens, which is sometimes, it's mostly boilerplate, but obviously that adds on to your time for developing, so you can be a little more productive by this. And finally, there's prototype cells. And this was probably one of the most interesting features I noticed when storyboards first came up. Prototype cells are basically being able to create a cell within the table view
that they're used for. So you just design visually instead of having to make them in a separate view and then have to assign them to the table view, which is a bit of a tricky thing to do. And you don't have to put all the buttons in grammatically, put the positions in, all that kind of stuff. Now the cons on the other hand, like I said, we don't, at Future Help, we don't really use storyboards, and I already kind of told you there's a lot of cool stuff for them. One of the reasons is the one file idea. Kind of makes it difficult if you're trying to get multiple developers to work on something, because perhaps you have a couple designers and you want to work in a different view controllers or different views. Being able to have them separate files makes merging things together a bit easier if you're using like version control or something. But with just one file, it can be a bit of a pain. You might have some difficulty. Also, it's kind of difficult to mix them with views that you make programmatically. There's a bit of a tricky bit of code. I don't think Apple actually provided it for you. I had to look it up how you do it. So it can be a bit annoying. Third off, if you're still supporting legacy devices for iOS, it only works with iOS 5 and higher. iOS 4, I know that there isn't much of an adoption requirements for you. Most iOS users actually update whenever they can. So it's about maybe 10% that still use iOS 4, but if those 10% are, say, your business customers or enterprise, you definitely want to make sure you don't use storyboards. And that's the last thing I have right now. If there's any questions, like I said, I'll do my best to answer them. So just raise your hand, just come at me.